Economic restructuring and the politics of low-wage and unwaged work. If the three panelists would like to take a seat at the table there, we haven't decided in advance which order they'd like to go in, so if anyone has a preference, by all means, you can come and steal the mic up here. I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers before turning it over to them. So we have Stephen McBride from McMaster University. Stephen McBride is Professor of Political Science and Canada Research Chair in Public Policy and Globalization at McMaster University, author of numerous books, most recently co-edited Orchestrating Austerity with Donna Baines. Definitely a very interesting book that I would encourage everybody to take a look at. He's presenting with Jacob Muirhead. He's a PhD candidate at the Department of Political Science at McMaster University.
Morning, everyone. This is a co-authored paper, and we have a division of labor. I'm going to do a short introduction for the first couple of slides, and then come back for the conclusion. And the heavy lifting in this job is going to be done by my co-author, Jacob Muirhead. Just a couple of, not exactly disclaimers, but explanations. The work, we draw upon a number of national cases, but it's not an explicitly comparative piece of work. They're all from the global north. We tended to use OECD statistics in places. So basically it's an illustrative rather than a really systematic piece. Secondly, we're very conscious of the fact that in talking about low wages and the problem of the low waged, this is only part of a broader problem, which is the low income issue. Obviously, wages, living or otherwise, address that problem, or can address that problem, but only for people who are working. So there's a bigger picture, I guess, beyond the wage issue. The first of these slides is really. I don't believe that the people who come to conferences on low wages probably need any convincing that there's a problem, but just in case anyone did, this slide sort of captures the incidence of low wage work by percentages for particular countries, in some cases by millions of people. The definition of low wage work is the, I think it's the OECD of 2/3 of the median hourly wage. Actually, the table probably understates the problem because it's an hourly calculation, and if people don't have sufficient hours, whatever wage they're making, they can still be low income. In the paper itself, we looked at a number of historical efforts to deal with low wages, including wages councils in the UK, the awards system in Australia. These are just sketches we provided. But the bulk of the discussion is on the minimum wage, which comes in two forms: a statutory universal minimum, or a minimum wage emerging from a collective bargaining situation, usually by sector, and then finally at the living wage. One of the conclusions, but Jacob will make these points as he goes along, is that they all have pluses and equally they all have minuses. They've all had some success at certain times and periods. But the fact we're still here having a conference about low-wage work means that they've had incomplete success.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to start beginning by outlining some of the causes of the growth of low-wage work over the past 30 or 40 years especially. And there are two traditional market explanations which are generally thrown around. The first is globalization, economic globalization, as well as technological innovation. These two things have resulted in a downward pressure on wages. But I think that both of these explanations obscure the highly influential impact of neoliberalism as political and economic thought. This kind of free market discourse has been extremely influential and also extremely hostile towards organized labor more broadly. And as you can see from this graph here, for example, we've witnessed a pretty epic decline in union density in most countries in the global north. And a lot of this decline has been a political decision. This itself is a very big deal. For example, a study conducted by 2 Harvard sociologists in 2011 reveals that between 1/3 to 1/5 of income inequality growth in the United States over the past 40 years has been a result in the decline of organized labor. So the decline of organized labor has 2 implications for wage work, which I want to highlight. The first one is that, generally speaking, more generous collective bargaining minimum wage systems are increasingly spotty in their coverage and also inappropriate for contemporary labor markets. And the result has been a shift in a lot of cases to statutory minimum wages, which again, generally speaking, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, they set a minimum standard that is not sufficient to address low wage work. For example, the OECD definition that Steve recently mentioned talks about low wage work being 66% of the median full-time hourly wage. As you can see, most statutory minimum wages that we include here revolve from between 36 and 48% of this value. And to put this into perspective, a lot of the times these minimum wages don't lift a family of 2 above the poverty line. So the justification for these very low minimum wages that are thrown around, they're pretty common orthodox neoliberal arguments that labor and your wage is a commodity just like any other. It's a result of the marginal return associated with the product of your labor. And as a result, you should not interfere with the marketplace. No matter what kind of, no matter your good intentions, the overall economic outcome is going to be negative if you interfere in the marketplace. So as a result, once you interfere, there's increased unemployment, there's increase in consumer prices, these kinds of things. A lot of recent economic literature actually disagrees with these orthodox economic claims. Essentially, they argue that there is no or marginal impact on unemployment of more generous minimum wages up until a certain point. They also argue that it does not increase the price of consumer goods above, like 1 or 2%, so very marginal increases. And also more recent economic literature, talking specifically about the economic downturn, has talked about minimum wages as useful policies to address deflationary spirals by putting money into the pockets of low-wage workers who reinvest all of this money in the marketplace. So there are a lot of benefits, although this discourse is not as strong as the other one, I would argue. Regardless, oh sorry, I meant to show this. I was trying to show the relationship between the unemployment rate and hourly minimum wages. Again, showing the economics orthodox neoliberal arguments, and as you can see, the points that are pretty small, that are in red, those are all collective bargaining minimum wage systems that have very, very generous minimum wages, but also don't have very high levels of unemployment. So I've already talked about a number of the reasons for living wages arising, mainly due to the fact that minimum wages are generally considered poverty wages, organized labor and collective bargaining is in decline, these kinds of things. But I want to bring attention to the 4th point on my left, which is living wages campaigns are a good way of organizing workers in grassroots support at the municipal level against low wages in a post-union economy. And this is one of the strongest benefits that they have, is that they're really good at organizing, a semi-institutional response against low wages in a post-union economy. So there are 3 broad models of living wages that I'm going to identify. The first one is a targeted ordinance, which operates at the municipal level. It's found in the United States, but also internationally in London and also here in Canada in Westminster, British Columbia. And they're targeted because they only impact those whose jobs are connected to public finances. So they demand that businesses who contract with cities, for example, pay their workers a minimum or a living wage. They demand that businesses who have tax breaks or who have municipal loans, that they pay their workers a minimum wage, and they also affect municipal workers themselves. The effects of this type of system are very small. Some literature by Stephanie Luce, for example, suggests that they impact about 1 to 2% of municipal workforce. But however, they provide higher wages and benefits, although the generosity varies depending on the success of the campaigns, the living wage campaigns in these areas themselves. The second model is a geographic ordinance model, and these are more recent in the United States, and they also blend a lot into discourses around minimum wages more broadly. But they're functionally equivalent. The best way to describe them is being functionally equivalent to the statutory minimum wage, in that they're universal throughout the municipality. For all workers and businesses within the municipality, they have to pay a living wage. And like target ordinances, they vary, their generosity varies depending on the success of the campaign, where they occurred, and the cost of living. Finally, there's a participatory model, and this is found mostly in the United Kingdom, and it's unique more to the United Kingdom. And it operates differently than these other two models in the sense that they're inclusive and they're less adversarial in relation to municipalities and businesses themselves. So they seem to seek to bring them in and participate in the movement. In this respect, they don't rely on legal enforcement, but they rely on voluntary participation, and participation itself is based on the normative draw of the campaigns, on public naming, blaming, and shaming, and also on the reputational gains that businesses can receive through accreditation as living wage businesses. So to summarize, there are a number of conclusions to be drawn from the living wage campaigns. The first is that they do seem to be economically viable, even with much higher wages, sometimes 30, 40, 50, even up to 110% of the federal statutory minimum wage in the United States. They are viable. And what I mean by this is that they don't increase prices of goods very much, they don't result in unemployment, these kinds of things. So they have a lot of benefits. As an example, in Santa Fe, they've had a geographic ordinance since 2003. The city unemployment rate is below the state and federal average, and it has been since 2003, almost. It's at 5.2% right now. And all the while, the city wage floor since 2003 has been about 50% higher than the federal minimum wage average throughout this time. And it's also adjusted automatically with inflation every year. Another strength is that living wage movements are very popular politically. Lots of polls show support between 50 and in some cases 75% in support of these living wages. And that's largely based on their normative appeal that people who work should not have to work in poverty. This message is very well received. And the last strength that they have is that living wage movements they're very geographically flexible. So especially in a post-union economy, they can spread and they keep their core message, which is turning wages into a moral and social justice issue. Weaknesses, the enactment, monitoring, and enforcement of living wages is in many cases poor for a variety of reasons that I don't have time to get into right now. Overall coverage is also generally low. In the United States, for example, they affect at most a few million workers out of a low-wage sector of 35 to 40 million people. And finally, as Steve already mentioned, they only address the issue of low income for those in wage work. They don't address tens of millions of people currently unemployed, nor do they acknowledge the issues associated with unpaid work more broadly.
Well, anyway, we don't have a final slide, but we do have a conclusion.
We did have a final slide.
We no longer have one.
My bad.
Basically, our conclusion is that a sizable low-wage sector is endemic in capitalist societies or capitalist economies. The size of this sector, however, does vary over time, and the neoliberal period has seen an increase in its size. The different modes of dealing with this, which mostly we've talked about minimum and living wages, address the problem in part. But even if the living wage, which of course has a huge ideological attraction because it's rooted in this notion of fairness, that somebody works full-time should earn enough to live on, which is not really a contentious issue. Even if it were enacted more comprehensively, because it's calculated on an hourly basis, the problem would still remain in a labour market which is characterised by precarious work and the shortage of full-time, full-year employment. So, I mean, our conclusion is that there's a very simple solution. Living wage rates should be universalized as minimum wages in a context of full employment, which the nature of which could be debated, but in a context of full employment to ensure that everyone who wanted to work full-time, full year would have the opportunity to do so. And for that to happen, of course, it would have to be underpinned by a powerful labour movement. So it's a really simple solution. Getting there sounds a little more difficult in the current context. On the other hand, looking at it more optimistically, there's got to be some limit to the sort of inequalities which have been growing in the last decades. And I think the popularity of these various approaches to dealing with low wages indicate that those limits may be approaching in some way. What's missing is the coalition to take that sort of message and put it into force. Anyway, that's our paper.
Thank you.